Good afternoon. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and you're all in for a big afternoon of interesting intellectual, factual commentary about, thought I'd put that in there, about the insights that the brilliant people here have about how the world views both the opportunities and challenges of the new administration. It occurred to us before the November 8th election that we might put together a worldview of Washington afterwards. Little did we know that the election would be an earthquake and that there would be even more interest than there would have been otherwise. And of course, there would have been interest in what we had to say. So right after the election, we convened this group, and over time, we have added a few in what we call ground truth briefings. Those are telephonic briefings, often with Wilson scholars on the ground in other parts of the world. And I think we own this space, and I'm very proud of the fact that we have had more people tune in to our presentation of the world viewing this new administration than ever in our own past. And so today, the movable feast continues. We have 4 of our best and brightest addressing issues like the Middle East, and I think we added something else for you, Aaron. I think you got something else. China, that would be Robert Daly. Mexico, that would be Duncan Wood. And Russia, our own Matt Rajansky. They had the subject matter here. Aaron is actually our vice president for new initiatives and widely viewed on television and in the press. But to moderate this discussion, we have someone enormously impressive who's off her beat following our last 2 secretaries of state around the world, Indira Lakshmanan, who now is the Washington columnist for the Boston Globe, but in past incarnations has done radio, TV, NPR, and Bloomberg. I think it was Bloomberg. But she's traveled widely, has been bureau chief in many parts of the world, so she brings her own enormous expertise as moderator of this crowd. Let me get out of the way and let you hear from people who really know how the world is watching Washington. Please welcome Indira.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I just want to say that I was told that the last session that Wilson did like this, which was also live streamed, got 22,000 viewers online. So with these incredible scholars here at either side of me, we're hoping to even break that record. And we're going to be taking questions not only from the audience here in the room, but also from people watching online. And they can tweet those questions to @the_Wilson_Center. That's @the_Wilson_Center for tweeting questions, which we'll take after we start our discussion. So we have an incredible panel up here, and I feel like I could spend an hour and a half talking to any one of these guys about what Donald Trump is going to do in their part of the world that they're an expert on, and also what that part of the world is thinking about Donald Trump. I want to start with some breaking news we have now, which is about a missile launch in Iran, and a statement just came out from the National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, saying that Iran is now officially on notice. And so I'd like to turn to Aaron David Miller, who's vice president here for new initiatives at the Wilson Center, and he's a former Middle East peace negotiator who's worked for 4 different U.S. secretaries of state of both parties. His latest book is called The End of Greatness: Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another President. So that may be a challenge to the Make America Great Again theme that we heard in President Trump's campaign. So Aaron, start us off. Tell us a little bit about this missile launch that literally just happened. We just got a statement about it a few minutes ago.
Well, the launch is referring to a ballistic missile launch that the Iranians conducted several days ago. I didn't have time to read the entire statement that the National Security Advisor issued, but clearly, and I would say this about several other initiatives that the administration has now undertaken, to a degree, all presidents are blind dates. This one, perhaps more than most. But it's clear that much of what he promised on the campaign trail, including withdrawing from TPP, building a wall, trying to deal with extreme vetting in the executive order on immigration that he announced on January 25th. And now toughening policies toward Iran are clearly in train, which I think is quite remarkable and extraordinary, given the way Washington traditionally works. Normally, you'd have administrations assess, you'd wait until the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State were confirmed before you began to engage in large and broad policy announcements. I think on Iran, the question is exactly what is the administration going to do? The president has criticized the agreement as president-elect on the campaign trail. The options there are abrogation of the agreement. I don't think that's likely. Renegotiation of the agreement, which I don't think is possible. But I do think that you can have a situation in which the administration intends to be much more risk-ready in asserting an American effort to counter Iranian behavior in the region. And clearly on this ballistic missile launch, which the Iranians claim is not a violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, but this administration clearly, and Nikki Haley made it clear in her remarks several days ago, that Iran is now on notice. The question is, what is the administration going to do when, in fact, the Iranians test this latest statement by conducting another launch?
Is this the same kind of launch that we saw under the Obama administration after the signing of the nuclear deal? Because Iran was, of course, already criticized for, according to critics of the deal, being out of compliance. The Obama administration said, actually, we don't like these tests, but they are in compliance with the terms of the deal.
Well, the Security Council resolution is in the Chapter 7. It's not going to impose sanctions, or frankly, with the Russians and Chinese on the Council, I doubt if you're going to get follow-up action. But it cautions Iran. And the Iranians claim that it is not a violation of the agreement and it's not a violation of the actual resolution. Again, the question is this. The gap between tough talk and delivery confronts every administration. And when, in fact, you issue a statement in the name of the National Security Advisor, basically saying that Iran is on notice, you set yourself up for one or two eventualities. Number one, the Iranians get the message, and you won't see additional ballistic tests for weeks or months. Or alternatively, they do, in fact, test again, which then makes it fundamentally clear that rhetoric, particularly in the name of the president, is going to have to produce a consequence. If it doesn't, then American credibility is undermined. And even if it does, the question is that the wisest and most judicious course of action in the first 10 days or 2 weeks of administration? Clearly, this administration is determined to create a new frame of reference, both for its allies in this region and for its adversaries.
You and I have talked a lot in the past about the red line that Obama had set over the chemical weapons, and which then ultimately, once it was crossed in Syria with Assad's use of chemical weapons, we all know what happened with the president eventually not bombing Assad. So tell me, do you think that with this statement, is President Trump setting a new red line of some kind? I mean, what does the statement mean?
I mean, I think
you're on notice.
Given the fact that toughness and tough responses to our adversaries, with the possible exception of Mr. Putin, seems to be the new normal in Washington, then in fact, the Iranians should understand that I think the administration may be forced, even though it may not want to act if they again decide to assert their power and challenge this particular statement. Unlike the red line, you have an administration that is risk averse when it comes to interference in the affairs of other nations. You're not going to see a Trump administration, I think, pursue a nation-building approach in Syria or Iraq. You're going to see a tough American nationalist muscular response, which is highly risk-averse in many respects. But on the issue of asserting American power, highly risk-ready. And this may well be the first indication of this. We knew there would be a test between Iran and the United States, either in the Gulf as a consequence of Iranian Revolutionary Guard fast boats challenging American frigates, and apparently it may have happened the other day, and perhaps over ballistic missile technology or Iranian policies in Syria or Iraq or even in Yemen. This is the first indication, it seems to me, that the stage is set, I think, for a test of wills. And I think it's got a lot of combustible and very unpredictable consequences.
All right, well, that's a good segue for us because you mentioned that Iran needs to be prepared that this administration may be forced to act. So tell us, what is from all of the contacts you have in the Middle East, what is your view, particularly in the aftermath of this entry ban, which has caused such a stink here in the United States? I imagine it's caused an even bigger stink throughout the Middle East, particularly in the 7 affected countries. So tell us, what is your view? How is the Middle East seeing
I think
Donald Trump?
I think it's clear to those 7 countries. And remember, those 7 countries are the same list that the Obama administration identified as countries of concern as early as 2011. You've got 3 state sponsors of terror, Iran, Syria, and Sudan. You then have additional countries, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Iraq, where the Islamic State has made inroads and gains. You also have a pattern of weak governance in these 7 states. But what about the others that haven't been added to the list? The Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Emiratis. All 3 are very important to the United States, which I think is primarily the reason they weren't added to the list. Look, clearly the image of the United States has taken a hit, not just in the Middle East, but globally as a consequence of this executive order and the restrictions. My only concern here is not that in the age of jihadi terror we need to make sure that our security procedures are as comprehensive as possible. The real question here is, what threat are you trying to preempt or prevent? If you take a look at the 3 key elements of the executive order, what appears to be a continued ban, or not a continued ban, but perhaps a suspension of the Syrian refugee program. The Syrian refugees haven't come into this country in great numbers, and nor have any of them been implicated in terror attacks. Then go to the 120-day ban on the issue of our refugee program. Since 1980, when the Refugee Act was passed and some of these systemic procedures were set in place, not a single individual admitted under the status of the refugee program has ever been involved in an attack, fatal attack, against an American citizen. And that extends, frankly, to the 7 countries as well that are now on the list. The real danger and threat since 9/11 is not foreign terrorist organizations either infiltrating operatives here or directing attacks from abroad. It is American citizens or legal permanent residents or citizens inspired by, associated with, largely through social media sites. Those are the perpetrators of all of the attacks that we've seen since '01. So the question is, what exactly is the executive order designed to do? And I think it, in my judgment, is not going to further American interests, nor, frankly, is it going to do much to help our value proposition around the world either.
Well, you're exactly right that since 1980, in fact, it dates back to earlier, since 1975-76, there hasn't been a single person under the official refugee program who's committed a terrorist act in the United States that killed anyone. And back in 75-76, those were actually Cubans who did it, not people from the Middle East. And you're absolutely right, the Orlando Pulse attack, the San Bernardino attack, those were American citizens, those men who did it, and the wife in the San Bernardino was a Pakistani-born woman. Pakistan is not included in this list.
And
so
the K1 visa program under which she is admitted is still
legit.
Exactly.
And her country of origin
Right.
is also still legit. So the question is, if there's a perception that there's a danger to Americans from jihadi terrorism, it sounds like you're saying the provisions of this particular executive order do not actually address that. And in fact, I believe that you've said that it makes us more at risk.
Well, I think if you argue that the threat is primarily homegrown, associated, or inspired by pro-ISIS or al-Qaeda websites, then the question is, how best do you prevent that? I'm not arguing that you don't need to review vetting procedures.
The vetting procedures are already 2 years long
but even
for the refugee process.
Right, but I mean, look, you can make a legitimate case that, again, in the age of terror in which we live, take another look at it. But the real threat, it seems to me, is not the one in which this executive order is designed to address. And if you are interested in addressing the primary threat, then in fact, you really have to be careful that you don't alienate, stigmatize, or essentially isolate the best line of defense in this country against the emergence of jihadi terror among America's 3 million Muslims. And I'm not arguing that this executive order is going to force any American of the Muslim faith to somehow become radicalized. But you talk to anybody associated in the Bureau or even the agency, they will argue that without this community, we are more vulnerable. So again, I raised the question as to whether or not this particular executive order actually answers the mail. That's problem number one. Then you have the other additional problem of whether or not you essentially make matters worse. Look, since 9/11, there hasn't been a single terrorist attack in the continental United States directed or operated by a foreign terrorist organization. I don't take that for granted, but and I don't want to trivialize the threat, but I also don't want to hype it.
I think you mean in the U.S., not just continental, because there wasn't one in Alaska or Hawaii either.
Right, in the continental.
In the U.S. homeland.
Exactly. I don't want to trivialize the threat. And that's something else that we all have to be careful of. We are not, Americans love to declare war on things. They look for comprehensive solutions. We have the war on poverty, we have the war on mental illness, we have the war on drugs, we have the war on cancer, which hopefully we will win. But these wars suggest that there are comprehensive solutions to these fundamental social and psychological problems. And it is the same with the war on terror. We are now 15 years plus in the wake of 9/11. It took the Allies 6 years to defeat the Nazis in an extraordinary enterprise called the Second World War. We're already 3 years beyond that. And the jihadi enterprise in the international system may have suffered setbacks, but it is still relatively alive and well. The Islamic State will be denied its caliphate, but it's going to go to ground. Al-Qaeda is making a significant return in places like Syria through its affiliates. So the notion that we are going to, quote, eradicate ISIS from the face of the earth, in my judgment, is hyping the threat. So we have to find the balance between taking this really seriously and not scaring ourselves half to death.
All right, I want to pivot quickly to the Israeli-Palestinian question, since you're so well versed on that and have been a negotiator. But quickly, just summing up what you've talked about, it sounds like you're somewhat echoing what George W. Bush's former CIA director, Michael Hayden, said this week when he was saying that he fears that the order would put us more at risk by making us by alienating the Muslim community in the United States on whom law enforcement depends, and also alienating Muslim allies in the Middle East. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's frankly, when you look at it, it seems to be neither wise nor warranted. Along the lines, forget the rollout, along the lines, and again, I'm not quarreling with the basic reality. Perception is critically important. And the way many Americans perceive this threat is through the lens of 9/11 and through San Bernardino and through Orlando. And are we safer? Yes. Are we safe? No. And there's no way to hermetically seal and insulate a free society. And we don't want to. The question is whether the costs of this particular approach will somehow address the problem without making matters worse. And you have 220 million people to which this ban applies in these 7 countries. And just one more point. If you read the language of the executive order, you'd be hard-pressed to think how any of these particular countries are going to be able to comply with what the order wants. So it may well be, I don't know about the 120-day refugee ban, but it may well be in the case of these 7 that these restrictions will continue to apply. You're not talking about 90 days. You may be talking about a period.
All right. Well, we'll come back to the Israeli-Palestinian question in the Q&A because our time is passing, and I want to get to another thing that has been very much in the news, which is Mexico. So Duncan Wood is the director of the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center. He was a professor and director of the International Relations Program at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México in Mexico City. So Duncan, you know, take us through, had it not been for the entry ban, the executive order, there's no question this would be the #1 story on our plate, which is that Donald Trump was supposed to have a visit from the Mexican president. Words were said about the wall and about Mexico paying for it. A threat was made about a 20% tax on Mexican goods. The president obviously canceled his trip. So bring us up to speed on how Donald Trump's actions are being seen in Mexico, and what do you see as happening next in this three-dimensional chess game, the term that we heard over lunch?
So I had lunch with a good friend of mine who works with the Mexican government last week. And you know, we sat there and we looked at each other for a little while at the beginning of the lunch and took a sip of our drinks. And then he said, you know, we knew it was coming, but we didn't know it would be this bad. And we didn't know it would be this quick either. And that was the feeling last week, I think, amongst all of us who study Mexico, the bilateral relationship. The emails, the texts that I was getting from Mexico following social media was just that, oh my God, the sky really is falling. There was a sense that, in fact, there was a brinksmanship being undertaken on the part of the U.S. administration to push Mexico as far as it possibly could in order to get certain concessions. And in retrospect, this all seems like, you know, part of a now established negotiating strategy. And I think that Mexicans, once again, it's happened many times in history, they're feeling as though they may be the guinea pigs for an approach on the part of the U.S. administration. But what we've seen happen from the Mexican government, first of all, is that they got pushed into a corner. They had been very, very, very willing to talk, to negotiate. On the day that Mr. Trump was tweeting about how the Mexican president should maybe just cancel his trip to Washington, the Foreign Secretary of Mexico and the Secretary of the Economy were in the White House talking to their counterparts. Luis Videgaray, the Foreign Secretary, was actually with Jared Kushner trying to work out details of how the dialogue could continue in a fruitful way. And then it all fell apart. There was great sense of goodwill on the part of the Mexicans, even though they were very, very afraid of what was coming. And then the tweets came, and then it was all over. And there was that moment, I remember last week, standing there going, well, so what happens now? And thank God there was the telephone call the next day. And it was a tough phone call. It lasted an hour because there was a need for simultaneous translation. Or rather consecutive translation, sorry. And so it took twice as long as it should have done. But it was not a particularly friendly phone call the next day. It was a phone call in which both sides are trying to defend their positions.
And you know this from your contacts in Mexico, too, who are privy to what was said on the call.
Yeah,
as well as
and you know, I mean, it's what we would expect. I mean, you wouldn't expect these two men, after what had just happened, to be the best of buddies at this point in time. And both sides, I understand, have to lay out their positions, and they're drawing lines, obviously. Mexico had been very clear before this that they wanted to negotiate, they were willing to make certain concessions, but they were not willing to sacrifice the national interest. It's obvious. No government wants to sacrifice the national interest. And then they've come to the position right now where they say, well, this now has gone too far. What's fascinating, I think, is to see the domestic ramifications of all of this in Mexico. We know what the government has done. Now look at what Mexican society is doing. The Mexican president, who is the least popular Mexican president since polling began, received a 4% bump in the polls. Mexicans are rallying around the flag. Quite literally, if you go onto WhatsApp, all of my Mexican friends have changed their photograph to the Mexican flag. That's the movement that's going on. There are boycotts being organized of American goods. Mexicans are rediscovering their anti-Yanquismo. Mexicans are rediscovering nationalism. This is a really quite extraordinary phenomenon. I wrote a piece the other day where I said that, what took 21 years to build has been knocked down in a matter of days. And that's what we're looking at. I think that there are political ramifications far beyond this. Looking to the presidential elections in 2018, many people know that the left-wing candidate in Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is already ahead in the polls for 2018. This really does help his purpose to a certain degree. But more importantly, whoever wins in 2018 will be much more wary of cooperation with the United States than they would have been otherwise.
Well, I actually want to ask about that because the anti-American sentiment that you mentioned is a real risk in Mexico. The politicians are eyeing the election. Do you think that Donald Trump doesn't realize that by pushing and pushing on this, insisting Mexico's going to pay for the wall, which I can't imagine that any country would agree to something like that, that he is actually might be making things harder for himself, and the negotiation that he wants, this renegotiation of NAFTA, could in fact become more difficult?
I won't pretend to guess what's going on inside the president's brain. But what I can tell you is that Mexico has been put into that position right now. I think the best thing that could have happened is for the two presidents to agree that they're not going to talk about this in public for a while. Because what that allows is for cooler heads to prevail at a lower level, the dialogue to continue between those people who already have contact with each other. And I'm hopeful that over the next few weeks, we may actually see a more constructive dialogue. The Mexican president...
Is it reparable? I mean, is it something you can fix after what's been said?
It can be fixed, but there are certain things that will take a long time to heal. And, I've talked about nationalism, but it's the suspicion of the United States which will take a long time to go away again. And that it permeates not just in society, but in a lot of policy circles in Mexico. Certain political parties, but in fact you might even say that now it permeates throughout most of the political parties. Certainly within the security community, there's always been a deep suspicion of cooperating with the United States. That comes, that's something that we have worked incredibly hard to overcome over the last 20 years or so. In particular, the last 5 years, I would say, we've achieved extraordinary success.
Particularly cooperation with the Drug Enforcement Agency and their counterparts in
There's
Mexico.
been the fight against organized crime, against the drug cartels. There's been collaboration
human trafficking
between public security agencies on both sides. The Mexican military has come to an understanding with their U.S. counterparts. They've visited NORTHCOM facilities, something which would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. You have intelligence sharing going on that has actually been of use in protecting U.S. homeland security in recent years. And now we're seeing all that being dialed back.
Could it be undermined completely? Do you see, the arguments over the wall and immigration leading to Mexico saying, no, we're not going to cooperate with you anymore on security, and the improvements that have been made on drugs, organized crime, human trafficking, and not to mention criminals going over the border?
Well, let me just give you an example.
Reduced?
What's brought about this real rapprochement between Mexico and the United States over the last 10 years has been something called the Merida Initiative, whereby the two countries have worked together to fight organized crime. Right now, the Merida Initiative is not operating. The Mexicans are refusing to talk to their U.S. counterparts.
Since when?
Since last week.
Since last week, yeah.
That's it. I mean, you're seeing a shutting down of the channels of communication on that particular issue. And that's, I think, what is part of the bigger picture here, It's that, you know, we've talked about the wall, we've talked about NAFTA, but focusing on the national security implications for the United States of an uncooperative Mexico is much more important. And I always like to make this point. The United States is unique, I think, in world history as a great power in that it has two land borders, both of which are with friends. You know, look at Russia, look at China, surrounded by enemies on all sides. The United States is blessed. And now I think we're putting one of those relationships at risk. And I think that is a dangerous game to play.
Let's switch from the security lens to the economic lens. Of course, a lot of the argument that Donald Trump made on the campaign trail, and which arguably helped him be elected, was an economic argument about Mexico, and that, you know, we need to either tear up or renegotiate NAFTA, and that Mexicans are stealing our jobs. Well, let's talk about some facts. So 5 million U.S. jobs depend on trade with Mexico. Mexico is the second biggest importer of American goods. It's the third biggest supplier of goods to the U.S. So tell us how you see it. I mean, what's going to happen to the economic relationship if the Trump administration continues along these lines and focuses on this as the cause of what he called the tombstones of factories across America?
So I think that it's worth playing the game right now. What if NAFTA ceases to exist? Okay, what if NAFTA disappears or goes into abeyance, or however we put it? Well, the first thing is that we would revert to WTO negotiated levels of tariffs between the two countries.
And
right?
what would that be like? What would that look like?
Well, on average, we're looking at an average tariff of manufactured goods coming into the United States of around 3.5–4%. Some slightly higher than that. But on other products, it's actually really interesting. Whereas, for example, the case of chicken, okay? Chicken could enter the United States at a relatively low tariff level. I think it's around 6–7%. But American chicken entering Mexico, and the United States exports a lot of chicken to Mexico every year, believe me, that goes up to 100% tariff rate for Mexico. And when you start to go through how much the United States exports to Mexico, and it's not just the things that we normally talk about, which are auto parts and the parts of building a washing machine back and forth. It's things like grain. Remember that the United States exports enormous amounts of corn to Mexico because Mexico consumes an enormous amount of corn. All of a sudden, you begin to see that the people who would begin to suffer are farmers in the Midwest. You know, these are traditional red state voters. And once you begin to go through all of these things, you see that there is, in fact, a very real cost to a trade war with Mexico. And Mexico's always been very smart about trade wars. You know, in the conflicts it's had with the United States in the past, it's known exactly how to target certain products that are from areas or produced in certain areas of the country that are politically sensitive. Now, that's not even taking into consideration the cost of of imposing a border adjustment tax on goods coming to the country for the American consumer.
And what Donald Trump was talking about was the 20% border adjustment tax, which would mean that everything Mexican that we buy in this country suddenly a heck of a lot more expensive at Target and Walmart and stores like that.
Well, that was certainly the first message, was that this would be targeted against Mexico. We then saw a dialing back of that to say, no, this is the border adjustment tax, which is part of the congressional tax plan that's being discussed. So this would presumably apply to all goods coming into the country from wherever. And if we're looking at that, then I think we really do need to evaluate the impact of that on the U.S. consumer. The price of goods in Walmart is going to go up. We have to recognize that. And the fact is that you and I are probably not going to be the ones that suffer the most from those price rises on basic products.
All right, so wrap it up for us before we turn to another region of the world. A lot has happened in the first 10 plus days. Where do you see this going in 100 days? Is it going to get 10 times worse in terms of, a possible trade war, in terms of called off visits? What are we talking about?
So let's think that in fact cool heads prevail. Let's say that there is some repair work that's done, and that the Mexican president is either able to visit the United States in April, as is now planned, or perhaps there is another phone call between the two presidents, and that in the meantime there are all kinds of talks that are going on. I think we can expect that meaningful talks about what follows on from NAFTA, what is a renegotiated NAFTA, begin in May. Meaningful talks. The question is, will those be three-way talks between the United States, Mexico, and Canada? Or is it going to be the United States talking to Mexico and the United States talking to Canada? Because it seems to me that that is the preference right now for this administration.
The latter, to have bilateral talks with each side.
Having
yes.
two sets of bilateral talks rather than getting everybody together into the same room. Now, that is not the spirit of what we're used to in North America, but that may well be the new reality.
Okay, just very quickly, yes or no, could it be better for America? That's certainly Donald Trump's position, that if he cuts, individually does bilateral trade deals, he thinks he can get a better deal for the U.S. Is it possible to get a better deal than NAFTA?
Absolutely. NAFTA is an imperfect agreement which is, now an old lady of free trade agreements. Needs to be modernized. We've been saying it for years. When Donald Trump won the presidency, a lot of us were actually excited about the possibility of negotiating a modernized NAFTA that takes into consideration e-commerce, the services industry, the energy sector, all kinds of incentives and opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises which create so many millions of jobs. That's the opportunity, is to do that on a regional basis. If we begin to break it down, I think, into the United States and Mexico, the United States and Canada, I think we lose a lot of that bigger picture reality.
All right, thank you. All right, Matthew, I want to turn to you. Matt Rojansky is the director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center. He's an expert on U.S. relations with the states of the former Soviet Union, especially Russia and Ukraine. So very timely. Again, I could say that were it 2 weeks ago that Russia would be the very one, there's so much news going on, it's hard to keep up. But Russia, as you have said, is the one country that can literally obliterate the United States in less than an hour. Donald Trump and his National Security Council, I'm sure, know this. As Aaron pointed out earlier, it's the one country about whom he has not said threatening or belligerent things about revamping, about sort of doing the relationship. He sort of said we can have a better relationship with Russia. So tell me, what are the Russians thinking about us? What do your contacts there in Moscow say? Do they think, Donald Trump is a man who they can really do business with? Are they secretly laughing about us? How do they see us?
Well, for one thing, I think a very smart reason not to threaten and provoke and demean the Russians is that they can literally not only destroy the United States, but destroy the world by provoking a crisis with the United States. And lest we think of that as some sort of relic of the Cold War or such a remote possibility that it's not really anywhere close to our daily lives, let me remind you that there's a war going on right now in Eastern Europe between the largest country that is entirely within Europe, Ukraine, and the largest country on the European landmass, Russia. Both of them are very heavily armed. They have used a relative lull in the fighting for the last year and a half, 2 years, to rearm and re-equip their forces. The Russians are, of course, supporting proxies, separatists in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting directly, but their forces are by no means perfectly subordinate to the legitimate authorities in Kiev. And so the prospects that this fighting could escalate very dramatically into full-scale war in the center of Europe, really, are real. When that happens, you have to remind yourself that we have just rotated, I think, 3 or 4 brigade combat teams of Americans from all over America, young men and women from the states that went for Trump and didn't go for Trump, are now in places like Poland and the Baltic states with their tanks and their APCs and their guns and their missiles, and their job is to make sure that NATO remains an ironclad guarantee and that America's allies in the region feel secure. So where's the problem there? After all, the war is in a non-NATO country, Ukraine, and the Americans are in NATO countries. The problem is geography. As Duncan very rightly said, Russia has, other than China, more neighbors than anyone else in history, and it has, in particular, a number of neighbors with whom it has a very long history of tensions. Invasions back and forth, occupations back and forth, and really zero trust whatsoever. If you think that distrust is bad between Mexico and the United States, you should see it between Moscow and Washington, let alone Moscow and Warsaw, Moscow and Berlin, Moscow and Riga. And so I think what we're looking at now is an overall atmosphere of tension, fear, distrust, and dysfunction, wherein almost any kind of spark, whether it's one of our NATO allies, let's not forget we've got almost 30 of them now, so we certainly don't presume to know everything they're doing or thinking or control everything they're doing or thinking. One of them gets involved in this conflict by sending lethal assistance, by sending special forces, volunteers. That's a NATO-flagged country in conflict with Russia. What about a near-miss episode over the...
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
if, and I'm not suggesting in any way that they would, but if one of these countries would do that, it doesn't oblige the rest of NATO to do anything unless they get attacked. I mean, right?
Well, that's your interpretation. One of the problems we have with U.S. relations with NATO and Russia and Europe as a whole now is that no one quite knows exactly what's promised, what's guaranteed, what's certain, and what happens next. So another scenario which might be directly implicated by that arguably manageable problem would be, okay, so let's say that some Central or East European country does get more involved as they like to do in the Ukraine conflict. What happens then if the Russians say they don't like that and they whack that country back and they attack with cyber, with information, with some sort of hybrid tactic? I don't actually like the term hybrid because it's sort of vague, but you get the point that the Russians have capabilities that don't necessarily rise to the threshold of rolling tanks all the way to Lisbon. But they certainly have capabilities throughout Europe. Well, again, those are our NATO allies. We're going to be tested. I think Aaron's point of testing a new administration, it's inescapable, and I think Russia will be a major locus of the test. But this is all a reminder about why we really, really need to take the Russia account seriously, and why at the end of the day, I'll end on this, I don't think that the candidate Trump, President-elect Trump, and President Trump has been wrong to tread very carefully with Moscow and suggest we would like to engage productively. Now, he has been clear that he's not sure he can, whether it's the personal dynamic with Putin or just the conflict of national interests that we've seen cyclically over the last several decades. But given where we're coming from, it's always possible to get worse, but it would sort of be hard to worsen the U.S.-Russia dialogue from isolation and mutual sanctions.
Just thinking out loud for a second on the NATO and Article 5 obligations, I mean, certainly Estonia was the victim of cyber attacks that apparently came from Russia, and I don't think the rest of NATO came running to their aid in any specific way. That's just a thought in terms of, but it might be very different if there were Polish troops or special forces helping in Ukraine, and I'm not trying to say Poland is doing anything. I'm just for an example.
Let's follow that question through to its logical conclusion. Actually, where is NATO right now? Where are American troops and German troops right now? They're in Estonia. You could say, well, it took several years since the cyber attacks of the last decade. But in actual fact, that is what weighs most heavily on the minds of Estonians. We had President Ilves of Estonia here at the Wilson Center not long ago, and he talked exactly about that. They've retooled their defense. They've opened the Center for the NATO Center for Excellence in Cyber Defense in Estonia. And the fact of the war in Ukraine, and this gets back to why we've got to take that war seriously. This isn't sort of remote from American national interest. The fact of the war in Ukraine has been the main justification for a renewed American heavy metal commitment, if you will, to NATO. And now NATO, which is several hundred kilometers farther east and just a few hundred kilometers away from St. Petersburg.
All right. Well, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton tried a reset with Russia. We had that sadly mistranslated button incident, which became a sort of metaphor for the larger failure of the Russian reset. Now there's all this talk of this Trump and Putin bromance. They've spoken kind words, flattering words about one another. How much could that actually create a benefit for both sides, or is there, is it impossible? Does the personalization of U.S.-Russia relations, is it not really relevant who the guys at the top are?
No, it's very relevant who the guys at the top are, without question. And again, I think it's also relevant what they say. We can never know what leaders are thinking. I'm always troubled by these kind of crystal balls about what's in Putin's head, or because Putin, got into certain fights when he was a kid in the courtyard, then he's going to do this or not going to do that. Because the thing is, it's totally unfalsifiable. When he does it, we don't know why he did it. And if we're certain that he's going to do X next, he's probably going to do Y. That's actually one of the watch what he does, not what he says, is what I would say in that respect. But I tend to find that the personalized nature of U.S.-Russia relations is more destructive than it is constructive over time. So there have been plenty of cases in U.S.-Soviet and U.S.-Russian history of really pretty good functional personal dynamics. Obviously, Reagan and Gorbachev famously achieved one starting from Reykjavik. Arguably, Clinton and Yeltsin. But on the other hand, there was a tremendous amount of miscommunication that ultimately led to deep distrust. And lest anybody forget, it was Boris Yeltsin who appointed Vladimir Putin as prime minister and then acting president in his place. And a big part of that, he had reshuffled his entire government by the late 1990s. To a very large degree, Aaron, you probably saw this from within the State Department, because trust had been completely lost with Washington. Even though my dear friend Bill and my dear friend Boris were still nominally running that relationship. So I think if we can get a little bit away from a kind of complete dependency on the personal dynamic, I think the media preoccupation, to share my accusations evenly all around, with the Putin-Trump relationship does all sides a disservice here, because at the end of the day, they have literally had all of one phone call. And I'm not sure if it was simultaneous or sequential translation, but it might have been half of a phone call as a result. I think fundamentally that is a relationship that has yet to be explored in any meaningful depth. What we know is,
although we keep hearing people talk about a grand bargain and a
right.
summit in the first year,
and it's all speculation until we're looking in the rearview mirror and we can say definitively, look, grand bargains, you don't set out to do a grand bargain. Even Kissinger, I doubt very much, sets out to do a grand bargain. I think what you do is you look at the issues that weigh heavily on the list of top interests of both sides. What Kissinger definitely said going into meetings was, what do they want, what do we want, and what can we live with, right? But you don't do that.
Are Trump and his people saying that about
Russia?
Well,
I certainly hope so, and I would advise them to do that. And there are a number of important issues, like counterterrorism, for example, where I'm sure they're asking that question. The argument has been made, for example, I think by the outgoing administration, the Russians are weak, they have nothing to offer, it's a smaller, weaker country. I think Senator McCain refers to them as a gas station masquerading as a country. Look, if you expect these guys to have any interest in helping you out with your interests, it doesn't mean that you roll over and give them whatever they ask for in return. It doesn't mean you cut a grand bargain right after shaking hands or as soon as you say hello, on the telephone. But it does mean you've got to show them a sort of basic modicum of respect, and you've got to bear in mind where they're coming from. And I think on the issue of counterterrorism, we have very different perspectives about how you do it. We have different perspectives on Syria and Iraq, for sure. But I think we do share a very basic interest, which is that we would really rather not see this movement become kind of the dominant, defining global force of the 21st century. Can we agree about anything else? I'm not sure. But that conversation is yet to be had.
All right, quickly, wrap us up by telling us, you talk to people in Russia all the time. What are they expecting from Donald Trump? And although his new Secretary of Defense and his nominee for Secretary of State have come out with very tough words about Russia, we have heard more from President Trump critical of the EU and NATO than we have heard critical of Russia. So tell us what they're thinking.
Look, there have been a couple of major areas of speculation about U.S. policy in Moscow. One of them, of course, is the U.S. relationship to NATO. What I think the Russians wonder is there going to be a downgrading of NATO commitments or an abandonment of NATO? I don't think that's what the U.S. administration has been signaling. I don't think what Trump, as a candidate, was signaling was about getting rid of NATO. I think it was about readjusting, and maybe this is similar to the NAFTA argument, readjusting the kind of underlying relationships. He talks about NATO as being obsolete, but what he's saying is it's obsolete because it's not fighting terrorism, and that's the thing we care about fighting right now. And that's in fact true, right? Multiple NATO summits have raised the question of, should we become the sort of terror-smiting, knight errant of Europe? And they tend to answer no, and then they go out of area to Afghanistan anyway, when it's convenient. And so the Russians, I think, will benefit from resolution of that question as much as NATO itself will. But of course, yes, they'd love to see the United States say, you know what, more of these problems are really European problems, and we'd like to step back from that. I'm not sure that we'll do that, because remember, at the end of the day, as much trade as we have with Mexico and Canada, you know, the European Union, China, which is, you know, a little bit beyond that, but still part of the Eurasian landmass, and then, you know, the greater Middle East. I mean, these are huge, important economic relationships for the United States, and all of this stuff, one way or another, whether you look at combatant commands, or you look at trade and economy, or you look at political relationships, tends to run somehow or other through Europe. That's an incredibly important relationship with the United States. The other question I think that the Russians have from the Trump administration is, are they going to take some kind of unilateral action on sanctions? I'd be very surprised if a team that's looking to take a business-like approach to a negotiation starts the negotiation by saying, here, we're prepared to give this up. My guess would be that they would like something in exchange. Now, whether tactically they use the perception that they are open to rolling back sanctions, but that there is this pressure from Congress and from sort of an establishment view in Washington that says, well, we're going to hem you in. We're going to make sure sanctions stay in place, and European views on sanctions as well, to try and force the Russians into a corner where they say, this is our one chance, this is our last best chance to get back into the mainstream of the global economy. And if the Trump administration makes that offer, boy, we had better have our counteroffer and what we're willing to bring to the table ready to go. And I would hope that that would be counterterror cooperation, Ukraine, and other issues.
All right. From one great power challenging the U.S. over its regional sphere of influence to another, let's turn to China. So Robert Daly is the Wilson Center's director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. So Robert, you're equally busy as all your colleagues up here at the table trying to figure out what Beijing is thinking about Donald Trump and what's coming in the next 100 days. I have to say that, you know, the one action he took, which seems most relevant to China, is, of course, the canceling of the TPP. Right. And the argument that the Obama administration made throughout was that the TPP was something that was going to allow us and other like-minded, free trade-oriented, democratically minded, friendly to labor countries set the rules of the road, and that if we didn't do that, that the big boogeyman down the road was that China was going to set its own rules of the road, and that only too many countries in Asia would be, you know, happy to jump in on whatever China offered because the terms might not be as tough as what the United States would have demanded or did demand in the TPP. So tell us about the opportunity that the death of the TPP is handing to China.
Right, well, it was President Obama's formulation of the TPP argument. China wants to set the rules for the 21st century. We can't allow that. We have to set the rules. This really set the stakes for TPP passage a good deal higher than they had to be in geostrategic terms. The TPP was going to push a number of very useful pawns forward a square or two, but that was all it was designed to do. But by making the argument in terms of an either or, China or the United States, setting that terms for the argument means that America's failure is a signal, in fact, to nations in the region, in East Asia Pacific, to bandwagon with China. So by framing the argument in that way, I think that it helps set that up. So China, yes, is pleased for now with our withdrawal from TPP. To use a phrase from a Chinese scholar, this was a gift, not a victory. A victory is something that you work for and celebrate. This one just sort of fell in their lap. This was self-inflicted. And what they gain from that is precisely the signal that the United States may not be a reliable partner in East Asia Pacific, and in fact that the Obama administration's rebalance to Asia, whose validity, whose staying power had been questioned for a long time, that might now be a dead letter as well. The rebalance to Asia was supposed to be a three-legged stool. There was a military side, there's an economics leg, and there's a diplomatic leg. And the thing about three-legged stools is that you take away one leg and it comes crashing down. Is the United States now going to be seen as reliable? And we have already seen some signs of bandwagoning, of a tilt toward Beijing, certainly with Duterte's Philippines. And it was in relation to Duterte's sudden emergence, and despite the Permanent Court of Arbitration's finding against China in the South China Sea, Duterte then went to Beijing and announced that he was ready to work with Beijing and Russia and not with the United States. That was the move that China said, this is a gift, not a victory. But I think it applies to TPP as well. Certainly Thailand, another American ally that has been drawing closer to Beijing. Some signs that Malaysia may also be leaning that way. And again, this is, I think, that President Obama's framing of the argument and his pushing TP too late in his tenure can be blamed in part for this. And of course, Secretary Clinton had also said not ever would she pass the TPP. So this withdrawal can't be laid entirely at the Trump administration's door. That's the good news for China, but there's bad news too, in that China needs a stable, predictable environment, and the United States is a major determinant of that, in order to continue its very difficult domestic economic transition, and it's also undergoing a number of political transitions this year. And our pulling out of TPP is symptomatic for China of a now increasingly unpredictable United States, which seems to be acting counter to its own interest. And China sees this unpredictability playing out under Trump in a number of ways. One of the biggest shockers, I think, was President Trump's statement that he didn't see why he needed to be bound by the one China policy, and his suggestion that this was a bargaining chip that he could play with. And somebody in the audience may know which American said, this is not a bargaining chip, this is the whole table. This is the foundation of the relationship upon which all other negotiations occur. But to treat the one China policy as a bargaining chip is tantamount to breaking diplomatic relations with China. And again, China sees this kind of unreliability as very detrimental to its interest. It sees this too in our descriptions of perhaps a new policy in the South China Sea.
But let me interrupt you for just a second on Taiwan, because there are plenty of people in the United States, within Donald Trump's circle and even outside of it, who would say, well, why shouldn't we reconsider the whole Taiwan thing? They're a democratic country. They're much more like us than China.
Right.
I think, maybe Donald Trump doesn't know about the Shanghai Communique and the 3 no's. It's entirely possible he's not familiar with that and the fact that it is the whole table. So the question is, whether trying to shake up that table, is it necessarily going to cause everything to collapse? Or his calculation seems to be, hey, they need us as much as we need them, and why can't we set some new rules?
Well, I think you saw a perhaps useful shaking up of the table in Trump's phone call with the president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen. What I think that Beijing should pay attention to, and what I think we should pay attention to here in the United States as well, is that with that call, which broke precedent since 1979, no American president or president-elect has had any direct contact with the leader of Taiwan. And then President Trump did. And the notion that he accepted a call from Tsai Ing-wen as though she went to a phone booth and dialed up, and he thought, well, who could that be? And picked it up, and it was Tsai Ing-wen. This isn't how this worked. We know now that this had been in the works for a very long time. What was interesting is that when he had that call with Tsai Ing-wen, and there was a range of opinion on the United States about that call, but even among folks who wanted to defend the traditional way of doing business with China, you saw an admission that, we've been hypersensitive about Beijing's hypersensitivity too long. And there is room to, without changing what is really at the core of the one China policy, namely that we have a diplomatic relationship with Beijing and not with Taiwan. There is room within that to recognize that Taiwan is our 9th largest trading partner, that they are a mature democracy. It's up to us who we talk to on the phone. China's insistence that we can't meet with a leader of Taiwan, that's a gross interference in our internal affairs. There was actually Trump's disruptive action unveiled that a lot of folks are ready to reconsider the style under which we carry out the one China policy. But then when 1 week later he questioned the one China policy itself, there was much less tolerance for that and the kinds of critiques that we heard. Well, the space between those two reactions is interesting, both for America and I think for Beijing. And Beijing should, and I think they probably have taken note of this, realize that that old dispensation has probably changed. And yet we see almost across the board recognition that you cannot undermine the one China policy unless you are willing to break relations with China, which is our #1 trading partner, and with which we must stay in close communication. Very interesting that the order in which you asked the questions this afternoon, I'm not complaining about this, but it's reflective of the way that we look at China overall. We're most concerned with acute threats to our physical security from failed states and non-state actors. And then we have concerns about conflicts with Russia for the reasons that Matt has mentioned. They can obliterate the whole of the United States very quickly. But when we think about long-term threats to American preeminence, China and only China may have the potential to undermine that status and become at least equally influential in setting global rules for the road. And we know that, but because China is gradualist in its approaches, and because it's really sort of taken our measure and manages to keep its escalations just under the threshold that would draw us away from our very real strategic concerns elsewhere and our other distractions, we never quite get around to China. We know that, but it waits for another day. China, in the meanwhile, is on the move.
Yeah, okay. Those are excellent points. And I think that, I mean, I spent 7 years living in China as a correspondent there, and in the late 90s and early 2000s, everybody was always focused on every move that the United States made, but it was very clear in all the Chinese press that there was that China was playing the long game. Right. That, U.S. may be tops now, but that China saw itself very soon returning to what it saw as its rightful place, right, as sort of the world superpower, the world leader. So, they maybe are a little bit out of the line of fire of Trump in that, although he has called them a currency manipulator and has threatened to
He hasn't designated that he is.
He has not officially designated them, but he's called them that. That's what I meant on the campaign trail. He has not done actual actions like he has with Mexico and with the Middle East, at least in the first 10 days. So what is China? China, must be looking for what are their top priorities in 2017. What does China want from a Trump administration? Is there any way in which China thinks that there might be some pros to a Trump administration beyond what they had with Obama, who was very open about wanting to rebalance to Asia, and China didn't like that?
Well, it's earlier thinking about Trump, before the phone call with Tsai Ing-wen, was that if he were really a deal maker who would work based on coherent United States interests, they were ready to deal with that. They're extremely confident of their negotiating ability. Now that there's been a lot of talk of disruption, now that they are feeling disrupted, they're not sure what to make of Trump. As you say, he hasn't made a very definite move yet vis-a-vis China in these first 10 days. One concern that I have, which is a fairly common concern, is that the Trump administration could very well encounter China first in a real way under a crisis, under a threat, most likely from something like a North Korean ICBM launch, before it is otherwise ready to do so and under new, very worrisome circumstances. We have now in Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, for the first time in U.S.-China relations since 1979, we have two presidents who see this relationship in fundamentally adversarial terms, in different ways on both sides, but that's never been true before. Those views, furthermore, reflect the views of the people of the United States and China. 2014 was the first year in which Pew polling showed a majority of Chinese and a majority of Americans had a primarily negative view of the other country.
2013, you said?
2014 was the first time that happened. So we've never had this set of both leadership and personal attitudes. And this happens against a background of even greater regional and international uncertainty in which many of America's partners and allies in East Asia Pacific are questioning our staying power. But as the Trump administration deals with unforeseen fallouts of hasty announcements or actions, will it get around to dealing with China, to making appointments to China, to getting the bureaucracies on both sides reacquainted with each other before a crisis forces leaders with this set of attitudes and who have not yet had any other kind of relationship with each other to suddenly have to work together? I think the likelihood of that is fairly high.
And Donald Trump has openly tweeted that if North Korea is not reined in, that's partly China's fault. He certainly suggested that in his tweets.
Well, and how does that help the situation? It simply doesn't help. All of these messages are received in China. And there's a very important dynamic of the relationship that I don't think is reported here, is it would seem that when we get around to tweeting about or meeting about China, and I know the former has happened, I don't know whether the latter has happened at all. I don't know if we've had a serious comprehensive policy review. It would appear that with people in the Trump administration from the National Security Council and the other appointees, they're primarily focused on the Middle East, secondarily perhaps on Russia, maybe on immigration, in China. So these China discussions happen when? In the last 5 minutes of a weekly NSC briefing. But with all of these meetings, China, sort of for the reasons that you mentioned, China responds with a whole of government, 24/7 style. They can mobilize the entire government, and through the state-run media, they can have also a whole of populace response. So we toss these things off, and they land, not quite like bombs, but they land heavy in China, and China responds with everything it's got to our occasional dialing this in. And this is not the China of 1979. This is the world's #1 trading nation. It's the biggest market, it's the biggest investor, and it's increasingly interested in shaping global norms. So this cannot continue to be an afterthought, and nor can we let it be driven by crisis. We need to be prepared for this now, and we need, what I think in all of these cases, what you're hearing is there is no comprehensive policy review that looks at the relationship between all of these and many other issues, that looks at America's real capability, and that looks at both the short-term acute threats as well as the long-term threats, not only to U.S. interests, but to the international liberal order, which is what China represents.
Oh, I was just about to turn to audience questions, but you mentioned the international liberal order, so I have to throw you one very quick last question, which is Xi Jinping was down at Davos and right before Trump's inauguration and gave this speech praising globalization,
Right.
which is something that Donald Trump has heavily criticized, although he doesn't call it globalization, he calls it globalism. He wants an end to globalism, he wants Americanism. So if China is the one who's out there carrying the banner and the flag of globalization, now some global media are saying, oh, China's now going to be the one leading the international liberal world order. How is that even possible? China's not a democracy. How can they run the
Right.
world order?
It's probably not
liberal
possible
world
right
order.
now. You'll note, if you look at Xi's statements in Davos, he kept talking about economic globalization, by which he means the mechanisms that have allowed China to rise and prosper over the past 30 years. He isn't talking about political liberalism, and because China is increasingly illiberal domestically, and because its markets are not open and its tariffs are high, the developed world, at least, is not really buying this argument. But China is making investments. It is setting up new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, like the bank that is going to be funding some of its One Belt, One Road programs. It is providing far more global public goods. They provide the highest number of peacekeepers to the UN Blue Helmet team. So China is adjusting some of its strategies, and I think that even though its normative influence in the liberal developed world is still fairly low, its potential influence in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Africa, Latin America is growing. And so one of the big questions facing us is, are we still interested? And this has been a question, I think, throughout the campaign. Is American greatness in any way dependent on American leadership, American greatness, American winning, what Aaron described as the assertion of American power? None of those things is leadership per se, and some of them are seen as antithetical to leadership. And so one of the questions is whether we're still going to be in this game.
Great question. All right. I want to open it up to the audience here in the room and also the audience watching online who can tweet us questions at the Wilson Center. So I'll call on you. There's someone in the audience with mics, and please identify yourself when you ask your question, and please keep it to a question. This gentleman, his hand raised first. Yes. This gentleman right here. Thank you.
My name is Stephen Shore. Wonderful presentation. Any speculation about the future of nuclear non-proliferation with a Trump government?
Okay, thanks. Would you like to address that question, Matt, since the Russia-U.S. Nuclear issues? Would you like to take that?
Well, we've heard some statements and signals that cut in both directions. So on the one hand, unfortunately, the legacy of the Obama administration's final policies towards Russia, as I said, sanctions, isolation, pressure, tremendous mutual hostility, is that basically a renewal of the Obama administration's own strategic arms control treaty, New START, which is not itself about non-proliferation to other countries, but it's an incredibly important signal. If the world's two largest nuclear powers can't agree to constrain their own arsenals and do transparency inspections, then sort of hard to tell other countries not to proliferate. Trump has suggested that he'd like to get back to the table on that issue, and it is going to expire in 2021, so that's going to have to be dealt with before the end of this 4-year term. as we learned last time around, those treaties don't happen in a month of negotiations. It takes a long time. Now, would that be is that feasible as part of a grand bargain? Like I said, that's probably not something you're going to know going in. If you can fix the atmosphere and the tenor of the ties, establish some kind of institutional mechanisms where, I don't know, American and Russian security officials can talk to each other again instead of the naming and shaming dynamic and so on that we have right now, maybe it'll work. And ironically, the world might now be flipped upside down, where it used to be the old Cold War rule was, well, do arms control negotiations between sort of grudging and distrustful Soviet generals and American wonks and generals, and then we'll get to the other stuff, the sort of humanitarian, human security, trade. But now it actually might be the inverse. Maybe we do counterterrorism cooperation, maybe we try to normalize economic relations again, and then we try to get to arms control. The conflicting signals, of course, would be whether currently non-nuclear states that depend on America's extended deterrence, so our promise that we will defend them if necessary
So
with
Japan,
our nuclear arsenal.
South Korea,
Right,
and our NATO
that's right.
allies
And
that
then
are
maybe
blocking
Middle
their
Eastern
powers.
countries that are looking at possibly an unstable situation with Iran. Iran maybe breaking out of the agreed framework if the missile launch and so on leads to a crisis. If those countries are looking to develop arsenals, then I worry that it's the John F. Kennedy nightmare of there'll be 30 nuclear weapon states within the next couple of years.
Okay.
And I'd only add, there's a lot to worry about, because aside from the broader issue of strategic arms control agreements between Russia and the United States, you've got two serious proliferators, the horses out of the barn with North Korea. And the real question is whether or not this administration is going to look at Iran and whether by inattention or confrontation create a situation in which the arms control agreement, which that's what it is, and it's limited. 10 years from now, most of the restrictive provisions on Iran's nuclear development will go into sunset. So the administration is going to face
Well, there's some that end in 10, some in 15,
Yeah, but
some in 25.
in
and
terms of,
some that
yeah,
are-
it's not
yeah.
just our perception, it's our close friend in the region whose threshold
Right.
for proliferation with respect
Israel.
to is a lot lower. So those are two very live issues.
All right. We've got some Twitter questions, and this one, Aaron,
Yeah.
is for you. It's from a Twitter follower who's watching us live in Syria, who says, Trump has said that he's going to destroy ISIS. How is he going to do that? Does that mean boots on the ground in Syria or Iraq?
I mean, I would argue, and I've been wrong about everything related to the Donald Trump phenomenon from the beginning, so you can agree or not, that essentially with one significant addition, I suspect that the Trump administration's policy toward ISIS under probably the more careful direction of Jim Mattis is going to essentially continue the template that the Obama administration laid down, which would be limited deployment of special forces. They could increase those some. Intelligence cooperation, arming and equipping and training local allies. And the Trump administration faces two very important decisions. What to do with respect to arming the Kurds, which is going to have implications for Turkey. And second, whether or not they're going to continue the CIA's billion-dollar program in terms of providing sophisticated equipment to elements of the Syrian opposition. And the president-elect on the campaign trail said that we didn't even know who we were dealing with there in terms of these groups, and he was skeptical. So limited deployment of American special forces, maybe increased use of American air power, use of special forces to continue to kill ISIS leaders, and cooperation with local allies.
But possibly less support for the so-called Syrian rebels, since he has said,
Right.
since Donald Trump has said he doesn't know who they are.
Plus, and here's, I think, the new strategic element, testing the proposition that somehow, in exchange for continued cooperation, new cooperation with Russia against ISIS, and this poses significant problems in terms of, are we going to share intelligence with the Russians in view of the Russian hack? Are we going to associate ourselves with Russia's style of going after Islamic State and jihadi groups, which basically is, forget careful consideration of civilian casualties. Aleppo is a classic demonstration of how the Russians and Syria did anti-jihadi activities. You destroy, and then you'll see what the consequences are. That, and according to Putin, the senior role, I would argue, in the future of the Syrian polity. And that's why talks are not taking place in Geneva, or they will on February 20th, but that's why Astana became so important. Because the Russian, the Turks, and the Iranians, Kazakhstan, are basically calling the shots. And I think the bargain for Mr. Trump, and Matt could comment more on this, should not be trading military cooperation with the Russians against ISIS as the deal in itself. It has to be extended to Russian behavior on a number of other issues, particularly Ukraine.
All right, let's take another question from the audience. This lady here in the center.
Hi, my name is Liliana Rodriguez, national defense expert from Argentina and the EU former student. My question is to Mr. Duncan Wood. In case that the situation between Mexico and the Trump's administration gets worse, do you think that there is going to be any country supporting Mexico? Or and if there is one, which country do you think it will be? I mean, taking into account powerful countries. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
So the single most important country to support Mexico at this point in time would be Canada. The Mexicans are desperate for some kind of statement to come out of Ottawa that the Canadians are committed to a trilateral process on NAFTA, etc. And the Canadians have got a lot of goodwill, and the Canadians would like to help Mexico as much as possible, but they're also being pretty clear that if push comes to shove, then they will not sacrifice Canadian interests for Mexico. Okay? So that's one there. So they can't really count on the Canadians. What was interesting, I thought, was last week when things broke down between Mexico and the United States. The Chinese ambassador in Mexico City said, this is a time when we'd like to look at injecting new energy into our bilateral relationship with Mexico, not against any third country.
No, of course not.
No. And this comes on the heels of the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company winning 2 blocks in the December deep water bidding round in Mexico. China is very interested in building up its presence in Mexico.
Could I add something to that?
Please.
I was up in Ottawa 2 weeks ago. They've never had a China think tank that was sort of at the disposal of the government in Ottawa, and there's people up there who are trying to get one together, and this was to launch that effort. So I spent some time with the Canadian version of the National Security Council and some of the people from their foreign ministry. And the same issue comes up with Canada. They see the United States and Chinese relationship getting worse. They are looking to join the China-led Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they've begun exploratory discussions on a free trade agreement with China, which makes sense in terms of Canadian interests. But they are looking to dance a little more vigorously in this space between the United States and China. And with reopening NAFTA, China has every interest in driving a wedge between the North American partners and giving both Mexico and Canada a better deal than it might otherwise do. And this is why simply a series of bilateral agreements will not work. You cannot wish away interconnectedness, because if you're one-on-one with Mexico, if you're one-on-one with Canada, China's at the table.
Now, the reality is what China can offer Mexico is relatively limited at this point in time. There could be infrastructure spending, there could be oil deals, things like that. But in terms of replacing what Mexico gets from North America, integrated supply chains, you know, a regional manufacturing platform, etc., that's not going to happen. And so, you know, looking long term, we'd have to think about a sustained diversification strategy on Mexico's part to break that dependence upon the United States. But that's going to take a long, long time. The economic reality, or more accurately, the economic gravity that we see in North America is that Mexico depends upon the United States, and that won't change quickly.
All right, we have a question from Facebook from Matt asking whether Trump's warm, this person is presuming it's going to be warm, relationship with Putin and relatively frosty attitude to the UN will only further postpone any possibility of bringing an end to the Syrian conflict?
Well, yeah, so first, you rightly observed that that's a presumption, mostly because we just don't know what that relationship will be like. Trump himself most recently, on the eve of the phone call with Putin, said something to the effect of, I hope we get along, but I have no idea, basically. And so now he's had 45 minutes of more or less sort of covering the waterfront in this initial phone call to explore whether he gets along, and we really haven't heard very much out of that. So we don't know. But as far as Syria, and this is a good opportunity to come back to what Aaron said about what might be the elements of U.S.-Russia cooperation there against ISIS, this is a worldview question. This isn't really about a President Trump and a President Putin. This is a fundamental question about how Russia thinks about combating terrorism and how it thinks about what is the essence of a functional state. There's a term in Russian called государственность, which is basically stateness, right? It's not the legal term of statehood, the way the UN would define it. It is literally the sort of the elements of being a state and having state power. And Russia's biggest concern has been the disappearance of that from Syria. When the United States comes to the Russians, as we have done, as John Kerry did repeatedly, with a message that there is some alternate future for Syria, that, well, look, if we would just talk to this moderate opposition, if we would just, sort of add more and different people to the multi-party negotiation, well, we could come up with a workable future for Syria. The Russians just don't buy that. They don't buy it in part because they actually don't see a successful example of that. So they look at the Balkans and they see the opposite of that. We may still tell ourselves a success story. I think we'll know within probably the next year if it is or it isn't. Bosnia may be one of the early victims of the next round of European conflict. But they just don't see a scenario whereby Syria, minus not only Assad personally, but sort of the Assad state apparatus, has anything resembling stateness. And without stateness, you can't fight terrorism. That's the message. Russia's successful, relatively successful fight against terrorism in the North Caucasus from the 1990s into the 2000s, very brutal, very bloody, no question, lots of civilian casualties, was entirely about having a state as a cudgel that you could use against terrorism. It was not about, well, let's promise these people freedom and prosperity and let's rebuild their infrastructure. The infrastructure was obliterated. Now, they did eventually rebuild it, but after putting a strongman in place. So it's a fundamentally different way of looking at the problem that in principle we do share, which is how do you fight
a peaceful outcome?
Yes,
or in the end, how do you have
well,
a
we'd like to have
outcome
a peaceful
the
outcome.
Syrian war?
Absolutely. We even define, by the way, when we talk about peace through strength, we define strength differently, right? We often think in terms of soft power. Russia's biggest tool in Syria has been hard power.
So your answer to the question from Jaideep Singh, who's the person who asked it, seems to be that the U.S. and Russia have different worldviews, and so that might make it more complicated.
It's going to make it
complicated no matter what.
It doesn't make it impossible, right? But the pat solutions. What frustrates me more than anything is this sort of binary equation. Well, either we do Yalta, right? We get together, we carve up the world, and we agree to stay on one another's sides of the line, or there's no solution at all. Nothing is to be gained by negotiating with the Russians. And that, frankly, was the perspective of the outgoing administration, who were understandably very frustrated. But that's also dead wrong. There is a space in between, and it starts from talking to these guys, giving them a little bit of dignity and respect, which I think Trump is smart to do, and then coming up with an agenda.
The last administration did try very hard to work with the Russians again and again. Secretary Kerry was brutally criticized for trying to work with the Russians on a peace deal in Syria, but of course
Secretary
it never
Kerry
happened.
was not representative of the administration around him.
All right, fair point. All right, other questions from the audience? We have this lady here had been wanting to ask before.
Jan Smith on the Wilson Council and a freelance journalist. My question is, for the rest of the first 100 days, representing each region that you are sitting here about, could you review what you would like to see the Trump administration do?
Okay, and let's just take two more because we'll have to make this, I think, our final round for time. This gentleman right here on the edge.
Tom Mansbach. I'm curious from Mr. Daley if he could talk about the South China Sea and where Trump is going on that one.
Okay, good. And a third question. We have someone in the back here. All right, this lady's waving her hand. All right, give it to her. and
Yes,
very
thank you so
quickly, this
much.
gentleman. Yes?
I have a little note. My name is Anna Kovalenko. I'm fellowship of Wilson Center. And today in Ukraine, in Kiev, on the main square, thousands of people have come to Maidan and to say goodbye for 7 soldiers. And these young soldiers have protected our freedom in Avdiivka. That was a city on the east of Ukraine, and I say was because almost there is humanitarian crisis, and because Russians have bombarded this territory very intensive last few days.
So
And now
what
I
was
have
your
a question to
question?
Mr. Rozhansky. How do you think it is a dangerous signal to the US that has put many efforts to make the ceasefire work and to the conflict resolution, and the beginning of this new administration, Putin flexes his muscles to talk with the force? Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And then this guy in the middle right there, just make your question really quick. Thank you. And apologies to everyone we couldn't call on.
Thank you. My question is more on...
Could you identify yourself?
Sorry, Nizar Farsakh. I'm a leadership and negotiations trainer. So my question is more on the tactic of whether, and any panelist can answer that, whether you think the tactic of overwhelming policy in like, we had I think 20 orders in 10 days, is that policy of overwhelming policy changes is to try to get a sense of what is going to stick, or do you think this is actually the modus operandi of this new administration of just feeling it out all the way? Do you think this is just a first salvo to get a map of the world, both the reaction domestically and from foreign countries? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we can combine that tactical question with the first question of what would you like to see in the first 100 days. So let's go quickly across the table, give each of you a chance. What do you want to see in the first 100 days? And is this mass of 20 orders in 10 days tactical, or is that what we're going to be seeing throughout?
Well, in the first 100 days, I think what I would most like to see vis-a-vis China, but everywhere else, is this administration to do what other administrations do. Staff up. Put your people in place, get foreign policy professionals, obviously foreign policy professionals of your stripe, in place, and then conduct a serious policy review, worldwide, regional, and country by country, and conduct, side by side with that, a self-audit about what our interests are and what our real capabilities are, and then decide, and then issue the tweets. I think regarding sort of modus operandi, as with everything else in the Trump administration, we're going to see an evolution. We're going to see people come and go. We're going to see positions walk back. This is normal whenever there's a transition. It may be more extreme in this case, but the administration will increasingly run into things like facts, history, the existence of other nations, that you can't walk or talk your way around, and there's going to have to be a retrenchment. So I think staff up and do the policy review.
All right, and give us a very quick answer on the South China Sea question.
The South China Sea question should be determined by the policy review and the self-audit. What Secretary of State Designate Tillerson said in his confirmation hearing was that we should deny China access to the islands that it built out, and that the islands it built were illegally constructed. Technically, it's wrong that their build-outs were illegal. They were escalatory, they were worrisome, there were a whole bunch of things we have to pay attention to, but not technically illegal. And blocking access would be an act of war. To block ships, you need a military blockade, which is an act of war, and there's only one way to keep China's airplanes from landing on those runways, and that's an act of war.
Okay. Those barely got coverage in the news because so many other things that Tillerson said were focused on, but I think you're absolutely right to point out the facts on that. Duncan, first 100 days and tactics. Emma.
Yeah, so I mean, just building on what Robert said, I mean, while we've been sitting here, the Senate's confirmed Rex Tillerson. That's good news. It means that a team will begin to take shape at State Department. Ideally, we'll see the same thing going on at Commerce. You know, we have a number of people in the administration in cabinet positions who are friends of Mexico, who have expressed they understand how important Mexico is. What I would really like to see is not what necessarily Mexico wants to see, which is they want to see this all to be resolved in 100 days. I think that's probably the worst idea, because that will not be a good result for Mexico. We want to deliberate this. What I want to see in the first 100 days is actually what President Trump promised on the campaign trail, which was that he would ask the ITC to conduct a study of the pros and cons of NAFTA. I think we actually do need an impartial evaluation of what the United States gets and loses from the North American Free Trade Agreement. That would be a very welcome and worthwhile study, so that we can base any decisions that we have to make in the future on facts, not on the opinions or on campaign promises. And that's, I think, something which we really need to remind the administration about.
All right, thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, I would only say that we all have to understand the intersection between foreign policy and politics. It may be objectionable, it may be irrational, but it's a reality. I'll answer your question with a story, because it speaks volumes about my view, and it follows on both what Robert and Duncan said. In 1982, I'm a very young intelligence analyst at the Department of State following Lebanon and the Palestinians during a crisis period, 82, 83. And I'm sitting at my desk one morning and the phone rings, and a voice on the other end of the phone says, "It's the White House sit room, hold." So I'm holding, no music, but I'm holding. Next voice I hear is the following: "Aaron, yes, this is Vice President George H.W. Bush calling. I read one of your memos on Lebanon. Do you have a few minutes? Because I'd like to ask you a few questions about it." So I got off the phone and I thought to myself, you know, curiosity. This guy was not getting the answers he needed, or he needed additional information from his CIA briefers. So he picks up the phone, he penetrates, and Kennedy used to call the agency analysts and the INR analysts on Vietnam. But knowing what you don't know and being in a hurry to find out, in my judgment, foreign policy is not common sense and a knowledge of an atlas. It does require additional expertise. Now, I don't want to overdo this, but because common sense and judgment is critical. If you don't have that, you could be advised by 1,000 experts. Iraq 2003 is a classic example. But you have to know what you don't know. You have to be curious. You have to surround yourself with smart people who do know, and you then have to listen to what it is they say and weigh their recommendations. If I had one, and there's a lot you could do in 100 days. You could start an exercise program. You could learn how to program a VCR. It's a crazy metric. It's a crazy metric to judge any president. But if I had any hope and wish for this administration and the future of this country's foreign policy, it's that. It's looking at the world the way it is and making decisions. Yeah, you want to change the world, but find the balance between the way the world is and the way you want it to be, because in that balance, therein lies probably the most judicious and effective way to make sound policy and protect the interests of the United States.
All right. Matt, what would you like to see
Well, see,
in the first
it's
100
brutal
days?
to have to follow Aaron Day. I don't have a Bush story. You know, I think I can answer the Ukraine question as well with this very short list. One, absolutely, we need to recognize what is at stake in the various conflicts in which Russia is playing a role, including Ukraine, but also Syria, and what we have treated for a very long time as frozen conflicts in the post-Soviet space. I really, really hope we can be over that and remember that no conflict is ever frozen. Again, I'd point to the Balkans. That seems to be heating up again as well. So just recognize what's at stake here. And part of what is at stake would be my second point, is the need to really think about what global order means. Not necessarily the liberal international order, as if there's a pre-existing thing that we invented and we own, and it sort of can exist on its own without care and feeding.
Well, for 70 years it's existed.
Global order is what countries do. All right? And if we behave inconsistent with that, as we have done in the Middle East, if the Russians behave inconsistent with that, and if the Chinese behave inconsistent with that, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? There ain't global order. Right? So I think we need to think about our behavior vis-a-vis these conflicts, as well as the conversations we have, in terms of global order. It doesn't mean that we can throw out rules and principled statements and sanctions and things like that and sit back on our laurels and say, well, we said what we thought about that and we'll just wait you out, right? Because the world moves quickly and we're watching that happen. Third, I would say the Trump campaign, the movement that he led was incredibly good at pointing out the problems for ordinary people in the kind of global economy and the political system in which they live. Those problems are common not just to Americans, but to Russians and Europeans and I would imagine many others around the world. So the corollary to that is solving problems, right? So the most important thing, maybe not in the first 100 days, but the most important thing the new US government can do is demonstrate Americans have figured out how to solve some problems. It's been more or less, I would argue, since the Marshall Plan that we really persuaded the part of the world I deal with, Europeans, that we can solve problems. Right now, most Europeans are convinced that we can't. So I think that's the huge challenge and opportunity. And then lastly, just specifically on my narrow area, we spent the last 10 years slashing federal investment in knowledge about Russia, everything from, and the region, everything from language to travel and research grants to the kind of programming that the Wilson Center is involved with and elsewhere. I think we're paying the price for that. And I think that can be turned around, and the price tag for that is, I mean, it's the kind of money that falls off the back of the truck at the Pentagon every 20 minutes. So leave it at that.
All right. Thank you so much. On that note, please join me in thanking Matt and Aaron and Robert and Duncan and the Wilson Center for hosting this fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, dear.